I'm so good on these computers. Anyway, good afternoon, friends and newcomers, to our Friday special conversations with special people. I'm so happy to introduce our very special guest and friend, Elizabeth Redwine, professor of English at Seton Hall University. Elizabeth is very busy. She's an author, she's a professor, she has 4 children, and with her family, she always has time to say yes to me and to speak here for our group. You first spoke here December 4th, 2014. And then you spoke in 2016, then in 2017, 2018, on a variety of different topics. Each one, we learned so much from you. And it was fascinating and informative. And everyone I loved. In any case, I just want to say today is going to be about motherhood in Irish literature, not neglected women in literature, Irish motherhood in literature. So please, I want to thank you again for donating your time and talent to us. And after we find out about motherhood in Irish literature, you're going to have to do it about every other.
Definitely, so, I would love to.
No problem, right? Italian, Jewish, it doesn't matter, whatever.
Fascinating.
Anyway, thank you so much. And please let me give you a great big hand and introduce our wonderful guest, Elizabeth Redwine.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to be going back and forth with you seeing me and you seeing my PowerPoint, but I'm really grateful to the library and to all of you. I see so many familiar names and hearing familiar voices. So I'm really grateful for the support of the library and this community over the years. And some of the talks that I've given, you know, in the past 6 years, or 7 years, I guess, contributed to a book that's coming out in May with Oxford called Gender Performance and Authorship at the Abbey Theatre. So some of you will remember I've spoken about the actresses who helped write some of these plays. And I'm so grateful to all of you because now it's coming out in a book. And then I have another book coming out this summer called Tagore and Yeats, a post-colonial re-envisioning. So I don't know if people remember, but I gave a talk maybe a few years ago about the Indian writer Tagore and his collaborations with Yeats, and that's turning into another book. So you're the best because I get to try out my ideas and you ask good questions. But I was trying to think of what to write about today. So first I just thought it would be motherhood in Irish literature, but then I started reading more and more about the mothers of the main authors that many of us have read in school or taught, like Oscar Wilde, William Butler Yeats, James Joyce, and then I gave Phyllis a teaser. I probably won't have time to get too much into Shaw's mother, but she was a little scandalous, so maybe we'll end with her. And so I decided to today talk about the mothers who really made these poets and playwrights who they were. And unfortunately, a lot of scholarship has focused on the fathers. Why is that? Because the fathers left more of a written record than the mothers. And I'll talk about why that is. So I'm just going to read to you something that kind of gave me the idea for this talk. I teach a text called Shakespeare's Sister by Virginia Woolf. And what happens in this text, I'm sorry, I was trying to get my computer working. So a bishop has made this statement in the 1920s that if women can write as well as men, then why wasn't there a sister of Shakespeare, a woman like Shakespeare in the Renaissance time who wrote plays like Shakespeare's? Now, if any of you are mothers or aunts or grandmothers, you know how much work it is to do everything and to write books. And so Virginia Woolf writes this essay and publishes it in 1929 as part of her larger text, A Room of One's Own. And the chapter is called Shakespeare's Sister. And so she says, okay, this bishop said, if women can write as well as men, why isn't there an equally good playwright like Shakespeare? So Virginia Woolf writes this wonderful essay about how, let's imagine what life would have been like for Shakespeare's sister in the 1500s. She would not have been able to go to school. There would have been no education of any kind for Shakespeare's sister. Shakespeare got to go to school. She wouldn't have been able to go to school. She would have been responsible for much of the housework, so her brother could go to school. At about 13, she would have been married to someone not of her choice. And probably the marriage would have been to try to further the family's finances. And this isn't anything against Shakespeare's family. This is just how things were done. And then statistically, she had a pretty good chance of dying in childbirth. So Virginia Woolf says, that's why there was no Renaissance playwright named, Eleanor Shakespeare. And then at the end of the essay, she has this wonderful passage I'm going to read to you that kind of led me to think about what I was going to talk about today. She says, this is Virginia Woolf. She says, when, however, one read of a witch being done, of a woman possessed by devils, of a wise woman selling herbs, or even of a very remarkable man who had a mother, then I think we are on the track of a lost novelist, a suppressed poet, of some mute and inglorious Jane Austen, some Emily Bronte who dashed her brains out on the moor or moped and mowed about the highways, crazed with the torture that her gift of writing had put her to. Indeed, I would venture to guess that Anonymous, who wrote so many poems without signing them, was often a woman. It was a woman, Edward Fitzgerald, I think, suggested, who made the ballads and the folk songs, crooning them to her children, beguiling her spinning with them, or the length of the winter's night. So I was reading the Virginia Woolf because I teach that essay, and I thought, let me think about how the women who gave birth to the great Irish and modernist writers may have influenced them. Because I love this idea that Woolf says, any famous writer who has a mother, we're understanding that women would have written if they could have. So I'm going to have to switch back and forth between me and the PowerPoint, which is, I hope, is okay. And the first woman that I'm going to talk about today is Oscar Wilde's mother. And I want to quote one other writer first. This is Colm Tóibín. I don't know if anybody has read the book Brooklyn or seen the movie. He's a contemporary Irish writer, and he wrote a book. Colm Tóibín wrote a book about the fathers of the major Irish writers. And so he published an article trying to explain why he hadn't written also about the mothers. And he says, as I wrote an account of the lives of Oscar Wilde's father, Yeats's father, and the father of James Joyce, this is the contemporary novelist saying this. He says, I was aware of ghosts in the doorway, figures moving uneasily and silently in the shadows. All of these ghosts were women, the wives, the sisters, the daughters, the aunts, the lovers. Most of them, Yeats's mother, for example, or Joyce's mother, left no diaries and left no letters. The images we have of them are as long-suffering, disappointed, ready to fade into obscurity, just as their husbands seemed troublesome, noisy, as well as witty and original. And he goes on to say that even though there's not a big record, a lot of these women left, we need to try to see these ghosts. So I'm going to begin my presentation with Oscar Wilde's mother. And I'm going to talk about her for a few minutes, and then I'll show you some pictures of her. So Oscar Wilde's mother's name was Jane Wilde, but she had a pen name, as we think about the Anonymous that Virginia Woolf mentions. Her pen name was Speranza, meaning hope. And she was a pioneering poet, folklorist, and Irish nationalist. She lived from 1821 to 1896. And she leaves wonderful quotations, like she said, I should like to rage through life. This orthodox creeping is too tame for me. Ah, this wild, rebellious, ambitious nature of mine. I wish I could satiate it. She said that her soul was imprisoned within a woman's destiny. And she loved to dress up, which you're going to see in the pictures. And she said, if heroic deeds were not possible, she could at least dress with daring do. So I'm going to show you some pictures of her, and then I'm going to come back and read some more quotes. So let me share my screen. And you're going to see a few pictures of Oscar Wilde's mother, Jane Wilde. So unlike a lot of the women that I'm going to talk about today, Oscar Wilde's mother actually was able to write and get published. She published poetry about the famine in 1847, trying to raise awareness amongst British people and American people, as well as Irish people, about what was happening in Ireland. And she had a profound effect on her son, as well as being a poet in her own right. Her husband was a very well-known doctor and was knighted by the Queen Victoria, and also treated Queen Victoria. Sadly, towards the end of her husband's life, he was accused of assaulting a woman when she was under chloroform in his surgery. Don't know if it happened or not. I kind of think it probably did from what I've read about him. And the family lost a lot of money in the lawsuit, and then they didn't realize how much money until he had died. And then she was left penniless in 1876 and lived the rest of her life with her children, writing and trying to make enough money to live on. She was born upper middle class, as you can kind of tell by what she's wearing here. She dresses.
Can you describe it to people? Can you describe it to people?
So she's wearing like a lace collar, and she has pearls all in her very well done, beautiful hair I wish I had, like thick, gorgeous, dark hair. She has blue eyes, and she's just dressed to impress, as she said she would do. So it was very difficult for them financially. There's another picture of her that's like a drawing, and it looks like there's clouds and wind around her. She was very dramatic. And then I love this. There's a picture of her next to her son, Oscar Wilde. And you can really see the resemblance. Two very fashionable, dramatic characters. So I'll stop sharing now because that's it for my pictures of her. But I wanted you to get a sense, either through my description or through seeing them, of what she looked like. So Oscar Wilde's mother said she loved improving on reality. And like her son, I love this about her, she would never commit to a specific age. So when people pressed her about her birth dates, she would say, because she became quite famous as a writer, she would reply airily that her birth had never been recorded, no registry office having been required when giants still walked the earth. So she liked to pretend she came from this like magical folklore realm. So life was difficult. You know, her husband was knighted and everything was going well, and they were both from these kind of upper class backgrounds. And in a pattern that will be familiar, it happens to a lot of these mothers, due to her husband's poor choices and secrecy. She finds out when he dies that they're totally in debt and out of money. And so she joins her sons and lives with her older son, Willie, in poverty, supplementing their income by writing for fashionable magazines, and producing as many books as she can. And her writing definitely influenced Oscar Wilde. I'm just going to read to you. I have it on the PowerPoint. I'm still sharing my screen, right? Am I still sharing my screen? No, I'll share it again. So I'm going to just do a selection of one of her poems, and I'll show it for those of you who can see, and for those of you who can't see, I'll just read it. So if you can see the screen, you'll see it up here. The poem was written against the British habit of ignoring the Irish famine. And she was trying to raise awareness. And, you know, she's one of these political writers where she was trying to write poetry to help those suffering from the famine and to pay her own rent, you know? So she says, little children, tears are strange upon your infant faces. God meant you but to smile within your mother's soft embraces. Oh, we know not what is smiling, and we know not what is dying. We are hungry, very hungry, and we cannot stop our crying. So she goes on to describe the effect of the famine on these children. And, motherhood is a major part of her poem. So I just wanted to kind of share Lady Wilde's story. It's interesting that we all know about Oscar Wilde and few of us know as much about Lady Wilde. I also have to share the names of her sons and daughter. Listen to what she named her children, because it definitely explains that she was a poet. Her first son is William Charles Kingsbury Wilde. Her son, the famous one, is Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde. And her daughter, who only lived to be 10 years old, was Isola Francesca Emily Wilde. So you can see that she was a very dramatic woman and tried to live life to the fullest, despite, all of the ways that she was limited by her gender and by that poverty. So she died of complications from bronchitis, and it's very sad. In 1896, when she was dying, her son Oscar was in prison. At that time, being gay was a crime, and he was imprisoned for that. And she was dying, and she asked to see her son Oscar, and she was refused. The story is, and I don't know who believes in ghosts and who doesn't believe in ghosts, but the older I get, I sort of believe in ghosts, that her ghost, or her fetch was the Irish term for it, appeared in Oscar Wilde's prison cell as she was dying at home on the 3rd of February in 1896. Her son Oscar tried to pay for her burial, but she was buried anonymously in common ground without a headstone because it was expensive at the time and he was in prison. And her older son was penniless at the time. So, since then she's kind of been rediscovered and has monuments put up to her. But I think her story of, being born into some wealth, marrying, losing one child, moving in with her sons and trying to support them all, and then, trying to see her son as she's dying and not being allowed to is really moving. And I also think her writing really influenced Oscar's writing. So I'm going to go on to talk about Yeats. And you know what? If we only get through Yeats and Oscar Wilde, then I would more than happily come back and talk about Joyce and Shaw another day. But in terms of Yeats's mother, to me, it's really fascinating. In a lot of ways, she's very different from Oscar Wilde's mother. She was also born into a kind of merchant upper middle class in Ireland. Her family, the Pollexfens, were a quiet, seafaring family. And she met, and after a 3-day romance, which I will tell my children, maybe not the best decision, married, maybe 2 days, maybe 3, John Butler Yeats, who was very dashing. And he was in law school, so she was confident that he was going to be a lawyer. He quit law school and became a portrait painter, and he really struggled to finish portraits or to charge people for their portraits. So he would see someone see Clara or Phyllis or Myra and paint your portrait, but then he kind of felt bad asking for you to pay for it. So they had children and there was no money and the finances just got worse and worse and worse. They tried to move to London for him to pursue his painting. She was really homesick for Sligo. They ended up going back to Sligo where she could at least get the support of her family. And she started to fall into a depression. In 1873, her son Robert, Yeats's younger brother, died. She ended up having Yeats, and then Yeats had 3 sisters who were very successful in their own right as publishers and producers of books of poetry. But after Robert died in 1873, and with all of the financial difficulty, she sank into a depression. And there's actually been a lot of really interesting research on how Yeats wrote about her mental illness in a very interesting way. So at the time, and I still have some of this in my family, if someone was mentally ill or if someone died young, the idea was that the fairies had taken them away and maybe put a changeling in their place. Is kind of comforting. There's a Yeats poem called The Stolen Child that's really beautiful, where the fairies say, "Come away, O stolen child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world is more full of weeping than you can understand." And that idea that the child would leave with the fairies was a comfort. Like if your 3-year-old son dies in the 1870s, of course, you're going to hope that he's off with the fairies running around the beautiful countryside and not having died. So I think it was a way to kind of explain death. Similarly, any kind of disability, whether it be mental illness or even, like autism, would be explained in this way. There is a moving part of that poem, The Stolen Child, where at the end, the child leaves with the fairies. And Yeats writes from the fairies' perspective, "Away with us he's going, the solemn-eyed. He'll hear no more a lowing of the cows on the hillside." So he goes on to kind of describe the cottage that the child is leaving. And when I would read it to my kids when they were little, they would say, "Wait a minute, Mom, wait a minute. The child can't go back to his cottage." And that's where the poem almost gets scary, is the child leaves with the fairies convince him, but then there's no going back to real life. So there's been a lot of research that's really interesting on how Yeats wrote many of his early fairy stories and fairy poems as a way to try to imagine his depressed and silent mother and his dead young brother off with the fairies. And I'll tell you, I'm just barely Irish. I'm mostly like Welsh, Irish, Scottish, English, whatever. But being from Boston, when my grandmother became way into her 90s and my mother would say, "Oh, she's off with the fairies." And I was like, was suffering from some dementia, but I think even in our day and age, it was a comfort for my mother to imagine that her mother was off with the fairies rather than an actual medical diagnosis. So it's interesting how these things continue. And it's really interesting to see how that affected Yeats's poetry. And then she did die, she didn't live that long. She started to have strokes. The more I read about how trauma affects the body through the centuries, I wonder what kind of a mind-body connection there was for Susan Yates's death. And when Yeats brought his first love, Maud Gonne, back to his house, his mother just went upstairs. Like she, I've had some family members deal with depression, and that's how it works. People separate themselves, and you can see how at that time the description of the fairies taking them away was a comfort. So I'm going to share my screen and show you some pictures of Susan Yeats. She's so different from Lady Wilde. There she is. So just to describe for people who are home, she looks very pensive and serious. Her hair is pulled back. She has a lovely face, but there's no pearls or lace or anything like there was on Lady Wilde. She's wearing little glasses like a reader. She looks like Yeats, but she has kind of a pinched mouth. And this to me talks of her depression, this picture. The second picture is a little sadder because it's Susan and her sister Elizabeth when they were young, before she'd gotten married. And you can see that the family was well-to-do because they're wearing these dresses that are out of like the Nutcracker or Downton Abbey. Like, Phyllis, can you imagine how much fabric is in that dress? And there's some like corset stuff going on. They were also Protestant. They've got very plain hair, but they're lovely girls. And I find this picture makes me kind of sad because I know how the story ends for her. And, it didn't end very well. And her story isn't that unusual. That's what's so sad. Many of us may have relatives who suffered depression after losing a child or postpartum depression. And So I feel sad for Susan Yeats. Here she is after she got married, right after she got married. I would say that's before it says 1873. I think that's probably before she lost Robert, because you see a change in her face after she loses her son. So in this picture, she's posed on some books. Books were very important to the family. We see they had a poet son, a painter son, and 3 daughters who were involved in the production of books. But hers is a sad story. One interesting quote that her husband, John Butler Yeats, said was, "By marrying her, I gave a voice to the sea cliffs. I gave a tongue to the sea cliffs." And what he meant was that even though she was quiet, there was something about her heritage and her love of the countryside that allowed their son to become a poet. So I will go on to James Joyce. And I only have one picture of James Joyce's mother. And so if you can see the screen, boy, I mean, that corset hurts even to look at it. She's obviously wearing a corset that's like so tight. And she's reading to little James Joyce, who's very sweet looking, kind of at her knee. And her husband is next to her. I feel sad telling you that this happy family scene was not really the reality of her life. And the reason why there's only one picture of her is that of all of the women we're going to talk about, she had the most financial struggles, so many children. And I hate to say that her husband was bad news, but anybody with daughters or granddaughters, you would not want them to marry someone like James Joyce's father, even though I think he was a lot of fun. He was a great tenor. The family started out with a small income. They were descended from Catholic landowners, and he just unfortunately drank it all away and would kind of go to the bar on the way home and drink all the money away. And she just had child after child after child. So I'm going to stop sharing and tell you a little bit about James Joyce's mother. And she, we see how Oscar Wilde's mother affected his poetry, how so much of his poetry came out of his mother's kind of flamboyant, dramatic style. We see how Susan Yates's retrieval and depression away from the world and experience of loss affected Yates's interest in the fairies. And the traumatic death of his mother affected much of James Joyce's autobiographical fiction. So I will explain that a little bit. And then it looks like I'll have time. Phyllis, what time would you like me to stop speaking?
Whenever. You're so fascinating. You could keep going.
Right. I'll talk till about 1:45 and give us some time for questions, because I just want to show you one wild picture of Shah's mother before we stop.
Perfect.
But let me just grab my notes. Okay, so Joyce's mother, her original name was Mary Murray. But she went by May, and her mother was against her marriage to John Joyce. The mother kind of sensed that there was something about this man who maybe wouldn't be a steady husband, and she was right. But they did get married. And her father was quite well to do. He was an agent for wine and spirits, and her mother came from a long line of Dublin businessmen. So when he first saw her, John Joyce was smitten with her. He was 10 years older than her, and he had 2 broken engagements behind him. And as we get to know John Joyce, James Joyce's father, we're going to understand why he may not have been a great match for May Murray. So there was an issue with his drinking from the beginning. And at one point, John Murray, May's father, objected so much to the match that when he discovered his daughter with John Joyce on Grafton Street, he put her in a taxi and sent her home. But they did finally get married. And this caused some issues between the families because this hadn't been totally supported by the parents. And when they got married, she was about 20. And, these women at this time, like how many times they gave birth and how many children dying in infancy, is just a tragic story. So at this point, the family's already losing the money they had because unfortunately, John Joyce, charming, beautiful singer, but he did spend much of the family money on alcohol, and they would have to move from house to house, like sneak out before the rent collectors came. So their first child, Christian John, died in infancy, and the father had already started mortgaging his property by the time James Joyce was born on the 2nd of February, 1882. And I love it because my twins share the same birthday as James Joyce, February 2nd. And I have to tell you a quick story, which is when my daughter was like 5, we were at a little get together of other Irish literature people in the city, and all the kids were playing. And one of the kids, I said, oh, my daughter has the same birthday as James Joyce. And one of the other little kids said, oh, who's James Joyce? And my daughter said, oh, he's some guy my mom loves. And I was like, he died a long time ago. I'm not like in love with James Joyce. So that was sort of a classic family story. I know, I was like, no, I'm not, but so I told my husband, and he actually had the grace to think it was funny. But sadly, 3 boys followed, 6 girls. She ended up having at least 11 pregnancies, and it looks like 10 survived. After a last boy died in infancy, her husband attacked her, and she fled the house with the younger children. And this incident was serious enough that the police became involved, and it marked another stage in the slow decline of the family. And I don't mean to be flippant about John Joyce's alcoholism. I mean, many of us have people in our family who struggle with addiction, so it's a serious thing, and it's just very sad that there was no AA back then. There was very little treatment. So he continued to drink. He didn't have a job. She had great patience and staying power. And finally, she just continued to try to stay with him. And then another child died in 1902. And part of these deaths had to do with the fact that they didn't have money for doctors. They didn't have money for enough food. I mean, there's a scene in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man where the character Stephen is trying to leave to move to France to become a writer because his family is just dragging him down. And he runs into his sisters in Dublin, and it's based on a real moment. And his sisters say to him, as the sister said to Joyce, like, please don't leave, stay with us, help our mother, help us. And he almost has to leave to survive, especially as an artist. So it's a very sad story. And she wrote James Joyce's father wrote to him after she was diagnosed with liver problems that turned out to be liver cancer. And James Joyce's father wrote to him, mother dying, come home. So he returned to Ireland, and this is such a heartbreaking moment. And I talked to my students about it, and we just don't know what to make of it, but his mother asked him to kneel and pray with her as she was dying. And Joyce he had been raised Catholic, but he had lost his belief. He didn't believe, and he refused to pray with her. And it haunted him, that refusal. He was trying to be true to his own beliefs. I just want to go back in time and say to him, I don't care what you believe, like, kneel, your mother's dying of cancer. But, and then there's a beautiful story. They all were gorgeous singers like their father. And there's a gorgeous poem. As his mother was dying, his brother sang this poem of Yeats's, a poem that William Butler Yeats had written. Joyce's brother sang it and played the piano to kind of help his mother along. And I'll just read you the end of the poem. I mean, it's like a love poem, but it's so beautiful. So the end of the poem is, though I am old with wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands, I will find out where she has gone and kiss her lips and take her hands and walk among long dappled grass and pluck till time and times are done, the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun. Now, Joyce could be very obnoxious to Yeats. When they met, Yeats was older than Joyce by about 20 years. And when Joyce was an up and coming writer, Yeats tried to help him. And Joyce said, "You're too old for me to learn anything from you, Yeats." And Yeats was like 40 or something. He wasn't even that old. Joyce was 20. You know, Joyce had a little chip on his shoulder. But Joyce was always grateful to Yeats for that poem that helped his mother as she was dying. That moment of Joyce refusing to kneel, like if I had done something like that, I wouldn't tell anyone, but he continued to write about it. And I think her death and that refusal of his was so traumatic for him. And he writes about it in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. He writes about it in Ulysses. So that moment haunted him of her death. So I do have time for the scandalous story of Shaw's mother.
Right.
I will tell you the story, and then I will show you a picture I found. So George Bernard Shaw was born in 1856 in Dublin in a lower middle class family. It's so interesting. Many of these families started out with money, enough money to get their children educated, and then they lost the money. Usually, it must be said, through the father's foibles. And then the mother was, in all these cases, the mother was left trying to keep things going. And something about that mix led these men to become writers, I think. And I can't figure out what that is. So George Bernard Shaw's father, familiar story, he was a failed corn merchant with a drinking problem. He actually had a vision problem that Oscar Wilde's father tried to correct. So it's interesting, like the connections between these families. Shaw's mother, Bessie, was a professional singer, and she was the sole disciple of Vandeleur Lee, a voice teacher who claimed to have these unique and original approaches to singing. It almost seems like there might have been like a ménage à trois with George Bernard Shaw's parents and this singing teacher. Very strange, although the more you read about people 100, 200 years ago, it's like nothing is strange. Everybody had these bizarre lives that we just don't hear about. Anyway, when Shaw was a young man, when he was a teenager, I just can't imagine, but his mother left the family with the singing teacher and moved to London. And the father doesn't even seem to have been that upset about it. And the children went with her. So I'm going to show you it's so bizarre. I'm going to show you this very bizarre picture of the mother, the father, and the singing teacher. All right, so if you can see it, the singing teacher's in the middle. He has kind of like mutton chop hair, like sort of bizarre beard, and his hair almost looks dyed. It's very dark and parted, and he's wearing kind of like a fancy jacket and has his arms crossed. And then there's like women and men all around him, kind of with their hands on him. The man in the back is Shaw's father, who has a beard. And if you've seen pictures of George Bernard Shaw, he looks like him. The mother is here in the stripes. So she's next to him. There's another very attractive young woman kind of like leaning over him. And there's a woman behind the music teacher with his hand on the music teacher's shoulder. I'm not sure who this guy is in the hat. I don't know what to say. I'm going to have to research this more. But the mother and the music teacher moved to London and the children went with them. So I just wanted to leave you with that kind of shocking story. And, you know, as I'm sure many of us could predict, real life with the music teacher was not as glamorous and exciting as, you know, the initial crush. So things became difficult once they moved to London. But I just had to share that last story because I thought, you know, people have always made surprising choices, not just to nowadays. So that's my kind of overview. And I think in terms of Shaw, you know, he always wrote about these women who were trying to find their way. And I know that his mother definitely influenced that. So it's a little bit before 1:45. So I guess I'll just open it up if anybody has any questions about any of these women, their influence on their sons or anything else.
Well, first of all, you were fabulous.
Thank you, Phyllis.
It was so fascinating to learn about something that we weren't even thinking about, and I'm sure most people do not know about it. So you introduce us to another interest.
I'm glad to
And
hear.
my first question, can I ask the
Yes,
first
of
question?
course.
A lot of Irish writers are sad people. Is that a terrible
No, I
comment?
think it's true.
Oh, okay. I just found, yeah. So maybe the harshness of their lives created this kind of the drinking problem, the
I think
the
I think you're totally right. I mean, I think, it's weird that this like small island has produced so many writers.
brilliant writers, right,
And it's
right.
like not, I mean, how big is Ireland? It's not that big of a place. And there's so many brilliant writers from there. Maybe there's something about, I mean, I think there's a history of folklore. I think their political nationalism was wrapped up a lot with writing. And I think that you're right, that history of tragedy finds its way. I mean, I'd love to come talk about Seamus Heaney one of these days, who I love, who really turned a difficult childhood and the troubles into beautiful poetry. Um, it's
And
interesting,
it's
right?
not, yeah,
It's
fascinating.
interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's weird to me, the patterns in these families, you know? I mean, these fathers who lost the money and then the women have to soldier on, and maybe watching those mothers do that was inspiring. I don't know.
Right.
Any other questions?
Yes, given the fact that it seemed that some of these women were of, I don't want to say wealth, but well off. They come
Yes.
from where they were well off.
Yes.
Um, I'm wondering if they had any kind of education home with a governess, and if, given that they participated wholly in the education of their children.
That is such a great, is this Tracy?
Yes.
That is such a great question. And I'll have to look into it. I would bet that Lady Wilde did. I'm sure she had a governess. And you know what, Tracy? It's so funny you say that, because when I look at my notes for today, I was thinking about motherhood and how the definition of motherhood even is something that we can question, because some of the upper class women that I study, like Maud Gunn and Constance Markovitz, and I've spoken about them in other talks here, who were upper class Irish women who became involved in the revolution. Their connections to their governesses and their maids were stronger than their connections to their mothers. Like there's this way that these governesses, and in the case of Lady Gregory, who's a wonderful folklorist, her governess, who was of Catholic farm stock, farm family, brought Lady Gregory up, taught her Gaelic, taught her how to speak Irish, exposed her to folklore. So not only have we lost the story of these mothers, but we've also lost the story of these governesses and maids and grandmothers and aunties who were just as important. So I can show you, I love it that you asked that, Tracy, because I have in the notes, like one of these days I'm going to have to do something on Mrs. Sheridan, Lady Gregory's nurse, who was more of a mother than Lady Gregory's mother. Lady Gregory grew up in a big house in Western Ireland. Like she would have been, if anyone's seen Downton Abbey, do you remember how the Dowager Countess says, "Oh, I was a great mother. My kids were presented to me once a day, perfectly dressed, and that was it. That I was a great mother." And of course, we know that all that what we would define as mothering was being done by other people. So that's a great question. And I think you're giving me my idea for my next talk, Tracy. I want to do something on the governesses, the maids. One in my book, I write about an Irish Catholic actress named Molly Allgood, and her grandmother lived with her. And she was engaged to a playwright named J.M. Singh. And he would say to her, "Bring in some of the stuff your grandmother says. I want to use it in my plays." Because there's a way that her grandmother, like all of our grandmothers, when they were living, had these ways of speaking that are lost, right? Like as the years go on, especially with the internet, we all start to kind of sound the same. My grandmother had so many expressions. And so he's trying to access that. So I love that question. I would say, to answer it specifically, Lady Wilde, I'm sure, was raised with a governess. And I'm sure that's part of what led to her ability to write and read. You know, some of these women had no access. And Virginia Woolf has a whole part in Shakespeare's Sister where she says, for reasons of class and gender and ethnicity, there's lots of Shakespeares out there who we didn't get to hear from, right? Because like, it doesn't matter if you could have been Shakespeare. If you can't go to school, you don't have a governess, you're married off at 13, you know, then that's it. So that's a great question, Tracy. Thank you. Any other? How about that music teacher? Wow, that was a crazy story. I couldn't believe it.
Oh, I know.
I loved hearing about the fairies,
Right.
because in growing up, there were so many stories and plays, and was it How Are Things in Glockamora, that
Yes.
musical, and it became, that's how I related to Irish culture growing up, and it was just wonderful. It's such a part of our culture.
Right.
Like the tooth fairy, I don't know if that's Irish, but
I know. Yeah, I mean, you know, and that's, sorry, Myra, did you want to say something else?
no,
Well, that's something also that we've lost in modernity, is many cultures believed in fairies and otherworldly beings. I love the story, even though it's so tragic, of when Lady Wilde was dying and she's trying to get her son released from prison to be able to come see her. She was so close to Oscar and she can't, but then the story is that she appeared to him in the prison, and I want to believe it. You know, I want to believe it. One of my professors in graduate school, Dr. Flannery, his grandmother was Irish. He was from Ireland, but his grandmother was Irish. And, you know, he's now in his 80s. So his grandmother would have lived, 100 years ago. And he said when he was a little boy and they would visit her, she would put out milk for the fairies every night. And he would say to her, "Grandma, you don't believe in fairies, do you?" And she would say, "Oh, of course I don't believe in fairies. But you know, they're there and they drink the milk. So you have to put it out at night." My grandmother used to like throw salt over the shoulder, all that stuff.
Right.
You know, I still do it. My kids were like, "You're hitting me with salt in the face." But you can see it, Myra, that, you know, it was therapeutic to believe that when the infant mortality rate was so high. And I even, you know, I have an uncle who I love and who has some cognitive disabilities, some neurodifferences. And you know, he's in his 60s and I don't really know what his diagnosis is, because it's just kind of explained that way. And there's something beautiful about it because it's not a negative. You know, if you're off with the fairies, it's like, it's a way to try to make it positive, I think. And so I think for Yeats, with the trauma of having that brother die and his mother go into a terrible depression, and, you know, back then there's no psychiatrist, there's no counseling, there's no women's groups, there's no AA. Like, these people, the suffering is just, and what they died of that we now have medicine for, you know, it's terrible. It's really sad. Any other?
And just to build on what Myra said, I think in one of the Outlander episodes, if you're familiar with that series,
Yes.
one family tied their baby to a tree,
Yeah.
and something that the fairies were going to come and get the baby because the baby was sick. It was just like the craziest thing. I'm like, what are they doing?
Gracie, that's right. I remember, I love that show. And I remember that episode. So the idea was like, if you left a child who was sick, the change, there's like this whole idea of the changeling. And so then like the fairies will, that's a changeling. That's not your real child. That's like a changeling. And the fairies will bring back the healthy child and take the sick child away. Because Scotland too would have been Celtic and had those same beliefs. The whole
Right.
idea of the changeling is really interesting. That, you know, I mean, and you see it today with like The Shining or Children of the Corn, like any kind of horror movie with children in it, is the idea of the changeling, that like you're not really the child you look like. Because so that's Tracy's alluding to something really important, which is sometimes the fairy thing was scary.
Yeah.
Sometimes it meant like if someone was a violent child, or that you would be fey, F-E-Y, which meant like, you know, you're not really the child. You're a fairy disguised as a child, and you've come to cause problems. And there are all kinds of superstitions, like my grandmother would make you knock a certain amount of times before you could come in, because like the devils or the fairies can't knock a certain amount of time. Like there's certain ways that they try to like suss out who the who the fairy child was. So yeah, that's exactly right, Tracy. That's exactly right. But it's scary in the Stolen Child. You know, even the title, The Stolen Child, there's not a lot of choice there. The beginning of the poem, the child's like, it sounds beautiful. You're going to go live with the fairies and run around the countryside. And then he goes, and then it's like, wait a minute, I can't go back to reality now. And I think that's how Yeats saw his mother, like she'd crossed over and almost like died before she died, you know. These women, I mean, and it's Women's History Month, so you know, we need to honor. I mean, to me, it's just like these men didn't just turn up as these Nobel Prize winning writers. Their mothers had a lot to do with it. And I bet Joyce's father was a lot of fun, you know, but someone asked Joyce once what his father did for a living, and he said he buys lottery tickets, he sings in the pub, he tells great stories, and he's a pretty good dancer. What he did for a living, you know. But there's poor May home with like the 10 kids. I mean, it's tough. They're always having to go get him from the pub, you know. And he never won the lottery. He would buy the tickets and enter like contests and stuff. It's tough.
Can you tell us about the book that you're working on?
Oh yeah, so I finished the book.
Because I want you to come back and you'll have to tell us all
Yeah,
about
well,
it.
I mean, the book that's coming out in May, you all have kind of been a part of it. It's these Irish actresses who literally helped the playwrights write their plays. So like, let's just say that I'm Yeats, I'm a playwright, and Myra's acting in my play and Tracy's acting in my play. And then Myra and Tracy say, you know what, Yeats, I think you should change this scene and you should rewrite it this way. So he rewrites the whole scene. And of course, nobody ever knows that Myra and Tracy rewrote it. He writes William Butler Yeats at the end, sends it off. And I don't even totally blame these male playwrights, because they didn't know better. I mean, they tried to give credit too, like in Yeats's Nobel Prize winning speech when he won the Nobel. He says, you know, the actresses helped me. And people are like, oh, no, they didn't. They weren't educated. They were working class Catholic girls. You're being too modest. And he's like, no, they helped me. So I kind of followed those paths. And I really talk about 3 main kinds of help that the women gave. They inspired the plays through their relationships and their letters. And then they rewrote the plays. They rewrote the plays after performing them. And then the third way is once the plays were in print, they'd act again and Yeats would rewrite them a third time and the women would help him rewrite them. And the same with J.M. King, who wrote like Playboy of the Western World. So the book is it's about trying to redefine authorship. And the hard thing is, like, we don't have much. And the reason we don't have much is, like, in the case of Molly Allgood, she was engaged to this playwright, Singh. She's helping him write all these plays. And all the evidence is in her letters. He died young of cancer. And he burnt all of her letters. And he didn't burn, I really believe that he did not burn her letters with a bad intent. She was wild. And I know her letters to him were probably not the kind of letters you would want found around. I can tell because some of his letters, she's written little things on them. And I'm like, all right, I know why he burnt her letters. because if her letters had been found, it would have been really disastrous for her career, I think. Because she, even in the letters that, like when she was mad at him, she was like, I'm going to make you jealous. I'm going to go on a date with this guy. And so then I thought, well, that's why he probably burned her letters, because he was trying to protect her, I think. So I've had to piece it together through reviews and comments that the women made and comments that the writers made. So that's kind of the focus of that book. And then the second book is Rabindranath Tagore, who was a Bengali Indian writer, and Yeats met in 1912 in England. And they became friends as colonial subjects of England who were working to free their nations through literature. They weren't violent. They wanted to free their nations through literature. And they started translating each other's work and performing, having each other's plays performed. And Tagore won the Nobel Prize in 1913 and Yeats won it in 1923. And that'll put a damper on a friendship if someone wins the Nobel Prize 10 years before the other person. The other issue in their friendship is Tagore was fabulously wealthy. So you heard how Yeats's family lost all this money.
Mhm.
I could show you, and I've given some talks at the library about his family, but his family mansion, they're still living in it all these years later. His descendants are still fabulously wealthy. And the mansions in India that his family live in, it's like my whole block in West Orange. So that created some tension. And then there was also the fact that Yeats could go places as a white man, even though he was Irish and there was prejudice against the Irish. It wasn't the same as the prejudice against someone from Tagore's background. So that book kind of explores all of those tensions. And it's it's a collection of essays. And I did it with my friend Amrita. And she's from Bengal and grew up knowing a lot about Tagore. So we wrote it together. And, it's been quite an experience. We both have kids, we both teach, and we're really good friends ourselves. So it's like, we're writing about this friendship and we're friends too. And so that's been a really interesting experience. I have to share a little secret. We had one person contributing to this essay. And a lot of people who contributed their essays were older, very established male professors. So Amrita and I had to learn how to, our first emails were like, dear Professor so-and-so, we had to be confident. And one of our contributors kept saying, I hurt my elbow playing golf. My elbow aches from golfing. Can I have another 2 weeks? And we were like, we've got kids. We've got jobs. Stop playing golf. We can't tell that story in the acknowledgements, but we wanted to. What? I would love to go play golf, right? Come on. So you see how kind of gender, still influences things.
Wait, you're fabulous. I can't wait to read the books and have you back, because
I've had so much fun, and I'm so grateful to the library for all the support over the years. And I think Tracy and Myra, you guys have kind of set up our next 2 talks could be the governesses and the maids and the nurses, and then also the whole fairy part.
you're terrific. And
Thank you,
with
Phyllis.
all you have to do, we really welcome you, and we appreciate this even more so than ever, because when you came to the library, you had coffee and refreshments. Now you have nothing.
I know. Well, hopefully next year, we'll all be vaccinated and we can.
Oh, I know.
Even if it's on Zoom, that's fine too.
Take care.
Thanks so much,
Be well,
everybody.
be healthy and happy.
Great questions.
And thank you again. Thank